field of study is the history of Christianity and, of course, our history. So who better to lead us through this sacred valuing of our history? Now, I remember how downcast I was when Tim decided to give up our beach views from Loyola Marymount for the snowy views, are there views? From Notre Dame. Go figure. I was a young mom and part of the way into my master's in theology at LMU, and Tim had been an amazing and encouraging mentor and guide. And I can attest personally that his extensive and impressive bibliography, much of it focused on the Latino community, is just as importantly reflective of the personal concerns in the center of his own pastoral life. Along with Hosman Ospino, Tim dreamt the Haciendo Caminos project, which through a large Lilly grant, thank you Lilly, brings together many of our institutions to serve and to support the theological education of young Latinas and Latinos. Our bibliographies and our lived commitments walk in beauty hand by hand. They should, don't they? So we were led in prayer last night by some of the young representatives sent by their institutions yesterday during our Pentecost sequence at Mass. So now as we welcome Dr. Matovina to the stage, I want the Haciendo Caminos Fellows to also stand so we can celebrate them with him. It's a beautiful way to see how our generations are coming together these days. And now I also want to ask all the current doctoral students to stand. Exciting future for us. So Tim, no te vayas. So Tim is going to invite the rest of our panel up, and I am about to pass this to you. This is going to be the ACHTUS edition of a really good interview show. And Matovina interviews the legends. So let us have Alan, Arturo, Ana Maria, and Roberto come up. Yeah.
Thank you, Ceci. We're not going to do introductions because they're going to introduce themselves in just a moment, but I'm really honored to be with this great crowd. So, buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Good morning. History can sometimes be boring. It's not supposed to be. History can be boring, though. Memoria is paschal and Eucharistic. So we're going to try to do some Memoria Historica here, make the history come alive in a way that makes it give life to us today, just like we do in Passover, like we do in Eucharist. So the first question will lead us into the introductions. I'd like each of you to say a few words, and please do try to be short because we've got a lot of questions to go through, but say what you need to say. Paint a picture of your circumstances when you discovered that you were a theologian. How did that vocation come? How did you discover it? Your own theological calling and vocation. Who starts? Gracias, hermano.
Thank you. There were many moments, but one specific moment was when I was invited to teach a course at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, probably because of El. It was the first course in U.S. Hispanic theology ever taught in the United States. From there came the edited book, Mestizo Christianity, that became well known because it was a summary of all the major voices at that time of U.S. Hispanic theology. But part of that experience of teaching at Berkeley was to give a seminar to the Jesuit faculty on U.S. Hispanic theology, which was for me more challenging than my doctoral dissertation defense, you know. Imagine talking to the faculty, the Jesuit faculty at Berkeley. Anyways, some of the faculty debated some of the things that I was presenting. And it was here that I realized that a brown voice was speaking to Eurocentric, white American assumptions about the way we talk about God. And for me, it was the voice of Hispanic theologians speaking publicly to an academia, like we had arrived for us. It made me feel like the voice of U.S. Hispanic theology was being listened to. It was challenging others, and it made me feel like habíamos llegado.
Well, my decision to become a theologian really happened before I became a Latino theologian. We'll talk about that later, I think. But it happened while I was in seminary, actually, studying to be a Benedictine monk at a seminary in southern Indiana, and I happened to be in a class in which we were reading a book called Blessed Rage for Order by the late, great David Tracy. And we came to the last chapter of that book, and there he mentions a theologian by the name of Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology. And as soon as I read that, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to do a theology. I want to be a theologian, and I want to do a theology that's rooted in a life of Christian discipleship, a life of prayer and struggle for justice. And so I went to my professor, and I said, well, it's a long process, but anyway, celibacy is not for me, but I'd like to do a theology. And I'm really interested in liberation theology, and I'm particularly interested in this whole thing of the relationship between theory and praxis. So where should I go to study and get my PhD? And he said, well, I don't know, but I studied at University of Chicago with David Tracy, so and here's his phone number, why don't you call him and ask him? And I was like, are you sure that I can do this? And so I called David Tracy, and he was, like he always was, warm, engaging, like he had, like I was his long-lost friend, and humble. And I told him, look, I really want to focus on this area of theory and praxis and liberation theology. And he said, where should I go? I can't go abroad right now for all sorts of reasons, but I want to study in the United States, and this is what I want to study. Where should I go? And he said, well, the guy, the theologian who's really the number one person, in my opinion, on that issue of theory and praxis is a guy by the name of Matthew Lamb, who's teaching at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And so here's his number, why don't you call him? So I did that, and he said, and I said, I'd like to come study here with you. This was August, and the semester started in September, and he said, well, I don't know if I can get you in that quickly, but I'll try. And so eventually he did. I went to Marquette, and while at Marquette, with his help, I decided if I'm going to study liberation theology, I should study all of liberation theology, and not just liberation theology as theology, but also the various schools and other disciplines with which it's engaged. So I developed a program, or Matt and I developed a program, he helped me develop a program in theology and Marxist studies. So I did a PhD essentially in theology and Marxist philosophy and Marxist political economics. So I took courses, not only theology courses, but I took courses in philosophy and political science as well. And while as you might imagine, I encountered a lot of resistance from the administration and faculty, but Matt fortunately was able to help me push that through. And then eventually I did my dissertation on Enrique Dusso, a Argentine, exiled Argentine theologian philosopher living in Mexico at the time, who also died a couple of years ago. And became, fortunately for me, he was a visiting professor in the United States at the time I was working on my dissertation in Indianapolis. So I visited with him in Indianapolis, visited with him in Mexico, got to know him. He became a real mentor of mine, and I did my dissertation on him and in dialogue with the Canadian philosopher Bernard Lonergan.
So I hesitate to say that I'm a theologian. I think I prefer to share with you how I got to the study of theology. And I would have to say that it's been marked by 4 moments in my life. One, just my childhood. I always start out with, I was born in El Salvador, so everybody raised the Salvadoreño flag. But I was raised in the Mission District of San Francisco, which is a very Latino population, and grew up in the shadow of what was considered like the cathedral of the Latino reality in San Francisco. And we had such support from priests that came from Latin America, and at home, my mother especially brought us up understanding the importance of popular religiosity. And so that was really formational and basic to me. But the second thing that, interestingly enough, came along my way was that I got involved. I entered the Sisters of Mercy. I'm a sister, and they had a real love and value of education. And so I was privileged to have education, but also in some ways got cut off a little bit from my family roots and how I had grown up. But I discovered lo cotidiano because I got involved with the Movimiento Familiar Cristiano. And I was so surprised at one of our first gatherings when all their language was how God and the sacred was in their life when they got up in 2 in the morning to take care of their children and go to work because they wanted to provide for the family. And I thought to myself, that's really interesting. It's talking about God, but en lo cotidiano, in the regular life. And I'm so grateful to that whole group, and I'm still in touch with them because they really formed me in understanding, before I knew what the word lo cotidiano was, the importance of that. The third element that led me to decide to enter the study of theology was the movimientos in the United States, the encuentros. And I've been involved in all of them since 1972, but the one that really marked and shaped me in some ways was after the Segundo Encuentro, where everybody was so excited to go out and get involved in the church and bring their gifts to the parish, and then they got to the parish and the priest would say, well, do you have a degree? Well, they don't have a degree, but they had everything else that, could provide for the life of the community. So then at the third encuentro, I thought to myself, we came to the second encuentro with all this energy and love to be involved in the church and to share understanding of the sacred, and we were turned away. So it's time for me to step up and go to school of theology, get a degree. I didn't even know what I was saying to myself. And that's what led me to decide to study theology, because I felt that there was going to be a need for Latino, Latina leadership in the world of theology. And lastly, I would have to say that in all those years, we had a lot of wonderful folks from Latin America, like Edgar Beltran, who came to San Francisco at one point and started Comunidades de Raza, and I got involved with that. We had Jose Marins, who was traveling the world, talking about Comunidades de Raza. So in a very short way, to tell you that those 4 elements shaped me into my understanding of what theology can be, and also gave me the impetus and the encouragement to go into the study of theology.
Well, my story, I think, in a lot of ways echoes the approach that Ana Maria took. Because in trying to answer this question, it took me all the way back to my earliest years. Probably one of the most impactful things that happened to me that is at the, you might say, root of how my life has unfolded after, was that when I was 11 years old, on my first flight, Western Airlines Champagne flight to Mexico City from Los Angeles. My mother was from Sonora, northern Mexico. My dad was German and Mexican. I have a German name, but he was part Mexican too. Both my parents spoke Spanish, but I was an Angelino. I was, as I like to tell the Mexicanos, I'm puro pocho, you know, puro, son of Mexican immigrants in the United States. And I identified as a Chicano too, by the way. Anyway, we flew to Mexico City. And it opened up to me the reality of a totally other world just right next door to us. It's like, you know, Latin America, Mexico. And I even at that point felt kind of a call to the priesthood in the religious life. And I thought I would enter in Mexico. But anyway, I decided that the Latino communities in the United States were going to be a rising reality, a rising presence, and that I should stay in this country and see how it unfolded, and so I stayed here. Okay. Now, fundamental to all of this was that, like so many Mexican Americans, I owe so much to my abuelita. My abuelita would drag me to church when I remember 4 years old or younger. I couldn't even see the altar, but I'd stand on the banca and I'd look up, you know, to see what was going on in our parish church. Interestingly enough, my grandma was a very devoted and hardworking lady. She was a seamstress, a costurera in the garment district of Los Angeles for 40 years, okay? And a militant of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, okay, which was accused of being communist back in the 50s, okay? Anyway, she wasn't a communist, but the union was accused of that. And of course, I began to sense the rootedness of my family and our culture and my identity in a really interesting religiosidad popular, if you want to call it that, and in the struggle of being bilingual and bicultural. Because yes, I knew that Mexico was down there, and we were Mexicanos, but different. We're different, you know, and as a bicultural person, you always sense that difference. My dad was a machinist and belonged to the International Association of Machinists, so my first inklings about politics had to do with the struggle of workers, okay, both on the side of my abuelita, who was a seamstress, and my dad, who was a machinist. And I remember reading the newspaper of the machinists and, you know, their political stances. And I remember being an enthusiastic supporter of, you might not remember, Adlai Stevenson in 1952, when he was nominated by the Democrats, okay? I watched the convention on TV. Why do I say that? My interest in theology has always had something to do with my interest in politics. Because I had a sense going way, way, way back that what is most enabling, what is most motivating, what will contribute most to the transformation of the world has something to do with the integration of faith and the struggle for justice, for faith and justice. Not just faith, not just justice, but the two of them somehow together integrated. And I saw in the energy that my grandma brought to raising her kids as a viuda. My grandfather was assassinated in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. That's what brought her to Mexico at that time. But I began to sense the connection between faith and knowledge and engagement with the social order. And there were other things that helped me grow in that. I remember I was in the 8th grade. They took me to a wonderful seminar in the 8th grade that the Salesian fathers were having. You might remember that the Salesians, since the 19th century, had been very much engaged in Catholic social teaching and the promotion of it. And that's the first time I ever heard about Catholic social teaching. And ever since then, I've been trying to follow Catholic social teaching. So that went along very well with my notion that social charity, social faith, social justice is an integral aspect of our understanding of God, and so an understanding of ourselves. So that I've always viewed the development and the theological development of our people as contributing to a fuller life for the people in general. So that's one of the big sources of motivation for me. And finally, I owe a lot to the fact that I always went to Catholic schools, and that my earliest formation was by women religious who gave me a very strong sense of the importance of knowledge, of the mind, of science, and the need to somehow take a critical attitude toward our faith, not just a pious or devotional one, even though I was very grounded in the Universidad Popular of our people. And I think that all of those interesting elements put together kind of explain how it is that I'm sitting here telling you this right now.
We begin. Thanks for starting with those personal stories. Let's move to the founding and the discernment of ACHTUS now. And maybe Arturo and Alan, you can start us off here since you were the founding figures.
Muy bien, pues yo le echo la culpa al Espíritu Santo y a la voz de los pobres. What was going on as a context, historical context, was that I mentioned padres and hermanas were very strong at that time, and many of us were with Cesar Chavez in Dolores Huerta with the Union, and just as a fact, the majority of people who were in the founding group of ACHTUS were either priests or ex-priests or seminarians or women religious or ex-women religious, and all of them working in places of the poor. All of them indentured farm workers or involved in some project with the poor in their parishes or in their communities. And they were all writing things. At that time, I collected about almost 200 articles and went to hear the voices of Hispanos before the academy, and I collected all of that. There were emergent voices. But what was missing was a serious, systematic theological reflection about God talk from within the faith of the Hispanic communities and also the sufferings of the poor. I mentioned that because I think that was kind of, it was stirring in there. The Spirit was moving nuestras voces, nuestra presencia. It was like our time had come. And then one day, Alan was, we were studying. Alan was, I think his several doctors that he had, he was one of the several doctors he was getting. And I was getting mine. And we got together and we brought up the idea of the ACHTUS starting an academy for Hispanic voices. And it was like we were thinking the same thing at the same time. And then we went to eat at a wonderful Italian restaurant and to discuss it further. And then Alan already had a reputation for bringing groups together. So we had our first meeting in Berkeley to see if it would go. And everybody who went, 8 of us, 9 of us, were very excited about doing it. So then we had an organization meeting in El Paso, su casa, where I'm from, and we went to Ruidoso to hash out the name and what kind of theology, what would be characteristic, and so forth. And the rest is history, and here we are.
Right. Well, Arturo and I were studying at the Gregorian University. He was in one doctoral program and I was in another doctoral program. So we had met, actually, if you remember, Arturo, there were efforts to bring the Latino seminarians together.
In Albuquerque.
In Albuquerque. That's the first time we ever met. I don't know how old we were. We were probably 23, 20, 22, something like that. And I think, you know, we had been a little bit in contact, but anyway, I hadn't had the chance to be with Arturo until I was back with him in Rome. And so we were living in that environment. Remember, it's the environment of the United Farm Workers struggle. It's the environment of the Chicano civil rights movement, of the Black civil rights movement. I mean, it was a very, very electrifying time to be alive. The Vietnam War protests and all that kind of thing. And the Latino communities were certainly on the move. There's no doubt about that, being on the move. I would say that there's no question that underneath the surface of our interest in promoting the presence of Latinos in American church and society, United States church and society, was the friendship that we were developing with Virgilio Elizondo, certainly with Virgilio Elizondo, because Virgilio Elizondo really was someone who we looked up to and someone who encouraged us so much in so many different ways. And for me, what brought a lot of this together was the experience of going to the Mexican American Cultural Center, where we met so many of the leaders. For instance, it was there that I met Enrique Dussel. It was there that I met Gustavo Gutierrez. It was there that I met several of the other Latin American, Ricardo Antoncich, many different people like that. And Rosa Maria Icaza was there also. And a lot of different women. And I think that's when I started to run into Ana Maria, as well as in work in California in pastoral ministry, Ana Maria and other women religious that were part of the movement at that time. And Pilar Aquino, of course, Pilar, who was the first woman involved in the thinking about ACHTUS, the very first woman, and then you came along soon enough, Okay. And of course, Ada also, yeah. So anyway, that was part of, one word that leaps out at me that we shouldn't forget to appreciate this Memoria Historica is relationship. That we are the product of really interesting relationships of various different sorts. Some of them are professional, academic, personal, social, political. I mean, it's really interesting, all those, and it's coming together, I think, this morning.
So, unlike my friends here, I did not grow up as part of an active Latino community. I mean, I was born in Cuba. My family and I left when I was 6 years old. I lived in Miami for a few years as a kid, but then I went through high school in Atlanta, Georgia, which at the time was the heart of the Bible Belt, and so there weren't a whole lot of Latinos. There were a few Cubans that I knew. My mother kept our culture alive at home. She didn't allow us to speak English in the house, and would punish us if she caught us speaking English. Every day after school, our after-school work was classes in Cuban history. So I had to memorize all of the presidents or not presidents, and the provinces and everything. So anyway, so it was not really until I was in college at Yale that I that I met other Latinos, and in this case, it was primarily Chicanos from California and the Southwest. And I became involved with them in college. And then afterwards, I lived and worked in rural Latino community in Alabama. And while I was in Milwaukee graduate school, of course, there was a large Mexican community in Milwaukee. I joined the Catholic worker community. But to go back to what was the original kind of instigation for me to identify my faith with justice, with the poor, was when I was in law school. I was planning to become a lawyer. I had no idea that I was going to be a theologian. And I was not happy with law, with legal studies. I found it intellectually fascinating, but personally not fascinating at all. I needed something that I could, that I would really be excited about and passionate about. And so for whatever reason, one day I picked up the Bible, and I decided, okay, I'm going to read through the Gospels from front to back, the 4 Gospels, which I'd never done. And I had kind of a St. Augustine moment, and I said, this is what I want to do. And that kind of religious conversion, quote unquote, was accompanied by a political conversion that I wasn't even aware of at the time. Prior to that, I had been pretty conservative. I had, like a typical Cuban American, I was very anti-communist, and therefore, and that kind of was the filter through which I understood all politics. But after that experience, I just thought, it's so obvious that the poor are at the center of Jesus' life and mission, and somehow that has to be, if I want to follow Jesus Christ, that has to be at the center of my understanding of that discipleship also. So that was how I got into liberation theology. Now, when I was in graduate school, I was applying for a scholarship from the Fund for Theological Education at the time, which I think is still around. And on the committee that were interviewing me was Brigida Elizondo. And so he was kind of asking me questions about my graduate program and why I was interested in liberation theology and all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, I'm interested because it helps me to recover and engage with my Latin American roots and as a Latin American. And I remember him looking at me in the face and saying, do you think you're a Latin American? And I had never thought about that before, because I just thought, that's what I was, a Latin American. So that was kind of what first got me thinking about, well, what would it mean to do a Latino theology? And then, that would have been the early 80s. Then a few years later, I get this, I'm teaching, I believe at the time at Candler School of Theology in Emory, and I get a call from Alan to ask me, to explain this whole project to me and say, we're trying to get together these recent graduates from, Latino graduates from PhD theology programs, would you like to join us? And see what we can come up with. And I said, sure. And so then we had our first meeting, which was in 1988 or something like that in Ruidoso, New Mexico. And then the rest is history. And then I became very, like Alan and like so many of us, I became very active in the Mexican American Cultural Center in San Antonio. That's where I first met Gustavo Gutierrez, and that's where one conversation I had with him that I always remember is I was convinced that I wanted to be a Latin American missionary, go to Latin America and maybe teach theology in Latin America somewhere. And in fact, at one time, I had already signed up with the Marino lay missioners to go to Latin America. And I was having a conversation with him, and he said, you know, don't come to Latin America. Stay here. This is where the problems are that are affecting us in Latin America. We can take care of ourselves. You stay here and do what you can to help the situation. So, and so all of that kind of came together in my mind to help me to understand myself as a Latino and not just as a Latin American.
So last night can you hear me? Last night, I already indicated to you that I think it's important to be clear historically, because I'm honored to be here with my brothers. I consider them mis hermanos, but I was not part of the founding committee that brought it together, as they're describing, the meeting in Ruidoso and then the meeting in Berkeley. But I was privileged at that time, because of the encuentro process, I had decided to go to Catholic Theological Union to study theology. And I arrived there in 1985. And while I was there, early on, I don't remember, because a year after, I was on the faculty practically. And I got an invitation, we got an invitation, there were a few of us there, that there was going to be this meeting in Berkeley in 1989. And it was about ACHTUS and whatever, and I thought, ooh, it sounds really interesting. And I was, the one thing that I had going for me is I wasn't too afraid of new ventures. I wasn't always sure where it was going to lead me. But I was always kind of engaged and curious about what could be next, even though I didn't think I had what could be next to be involved. So I thought that's really interesting. So I end up in Berkeley in June of 1989 at the first Colloquium. And I remember so clearly, I mean, I walked into the room, and I might start doing it even now, and the whole room was filled with Latino, Latinas, whatever we call ourselves today. And I thought, oh my God, this is like a really new Pentecost experience for me. Where did all these folks come from? But some of us had already met along the way in different settings, and the theme was Maria. And that just captured me. And Vigilio Elizondo, you know, brought Maria alive. And it was just a very interesting and wonderful gathering, lots of fun. This morning someone said, when you talk about the early days, you make it sound like it was fun. Yes, it was fun, and we worked hard, but we danced and we gossiped, and chismes were always part of the whatever conversation we were having. I know we can't tell those stories, that's off script, off the film. But that's how I began my involvement with ACHTUS, and then I got involved. I did this, I did the other, and pretty soon I'm on the board, early enough. I mean, I don't even remember how many of us were there, but it wasn't a huge number. Then I ended up being secretary, and yesterday when they were taking photos of us, I'm thinking, for photos, I was dragging binders across the country to the next meeting, because in the binders was the membership with their names and where they were, and a few of the articles that they had written by that time. That's what I was doing in those days. And then I became vice president, and then I became president. So my involvement with ACHTUS just brought me total delight, and it continues to do that. I will also say, I think this is important, because the four of us are up here, but there are myriads of people behind not only the creation of ACHTUS, but the development and flourishing of ACHTUS. Like I said yesterday, we had no money, and we had to get together as a board. So folks like Rafael Guevara, who's not here, he at that time was working at Camarillo Seminary in Southern California, and he hosted us as a board, you know, gave us room and board and food and a place to meet. And along the way, we always had these wonderful, Roger Luna up in Berkeley, his community did the same for us. So there's a myriad of people that make it possible for ACHTUS to be here today. So I think that's what I would like to say about my involvement, but it was an inspired moment, and I'm just feeling so grateful.
Thank you all very much. With that last one, let's jump to the last question here now. So for the younger people here, for all of us, who are some of the ancestors that you'd like us to remember, to engage, to keep alive in our reflections today and our ongoing work? Maybe mention each of you a few of the ancestors that you want to make sure we're not forgetting.
Two special people, Virgilio Elizondo and Alice Diaz.
Those would be mine too. Somebody else, Otto Maduro, who was a friend of our group, and yeah, I mean, there are others like Enrique Duso, who in my own life has been very important. Gustavo Gutierrez actually recently passed. Gary Rivias Reyes is somebody who was sort of huge, played a huge role early on. So.
I was thinking of, as Ana Maria mentioned, someone who really impacted on me was Edgar Beltran. Edgar Beltran had been Secretary of CELAM in Colombia, and then he came to the United States to really tell us about Medellin. And he traveled the whole country, and he put on these encuentros in which he explained to us the response of the church in Latin America, which is the response that helps us understand Pope Francis, actually, and what Pope Francis is doing, and what Pope Leo seems to be wanting to do also. It has its roots in the transformations that took place in the church in Latin America right after the Second Vatican Council. And Edgar Beltran was a very dynamic speaker. And he really communicated the methodology, see, judge, act, and all these approaches that have been so fundamental to our pastoral orientation. So I want to mention Edgar Beltran. And of the bishops that were, aware of what we were doing and accompanying us, of course, at different moments, we really should say, we should mention Patricio Flores, who was the first modern time bishop in modern times, Latino, of San Antonio. And also I want to mention Bishop Ricardo Ramirez, retired Bishop of Las Cruces, who really continued to be a very supportive Episcopal moderator at different moments when we were, having different cooperative relations with the bishops as an academy. And important leaders, we've mentioned Virgilio. I want to mention Mario Vizcaíno, because Mario Vizcaíno was a force of nature, really. And certainly in the southeastern United States, he was a man of great vision, that we should remember also. He passed away just a couple of years ago.
It's hard to limit. So let me mention 3 names and then I'm going to say something else on that. I was thinking of Alejandro Garcia Rivera, a beautiful Cubano that came to the United States, part of that Peter Pan group that arrived here from Cuba, a scientist, an artist. He's one of the folks that contributed to the development and creation of the theological aesthetics. Just so lovely, and I loved him. A gentle spirit, humble, and at the same time, underneath that gentleness, there was a firmness about what he thought should happen. So, and he was part of my plancha story last night. We wouldn't have the plancha if he hadn't picked it up and made it a gavel. And I should also take the opportunity, while I still have it, just to add that in a very inspired way, that plancha stood for lo cotidiano, which is at the basis of the kind of theology we do. That wasn't its original intent. When I thought about it later, I thought, what other symbol could tell us who we are and remind us of who we should continue to be? So I would also add Alicia Marie, Cubana, from Miami, a beautiful spirit, This woman had resilience beyond belief. She got very involved in creating Amor en Acción, which was to go out to Haiti, and worked there very early on. She got interested in theological studies. She ended up at Catholic Theological Union. Her health wasn't always very good. She had severe arthritis. But she came to the ACHTUS meetings as faithfully as she could and contributed, and became president at one point of our history. And then the last person I would mention would be Otto Maduro, the man with that deep, beautiful voice that drew attention to what we were doing and how we should be doing it. So there's so many people that are part of our history. And I think that's one thing we can't forget, that this is teología en conjunto. It's been done together. So there's for up here, there's myriads of people that are part of the story, and we continue to add to it. So we have community of saints, los santos que nos acompañan, and we try to be on the path that we're accompanying each other in that same beautiful spirit of familia y comunidad. Sometimes we fight, but we make up. And sometimes we don't make up, but then we're sorry. But that's part of our history, and it gives it the juice of life. I just wanted to say one last thing, because it just reminds me so much of Alex. Alex is dying. I go to visit him in Berkeley. And he says something to me like, it's like a jugo de mango. I'm thinking, there he is, probably in pain, dying, and he's talking about the jugo del mango que es la vida. And I think that's maybe for us, el jugo del mango que es la vida, and that we should continue to nourish us.
Could I just make one comment about Alejandro again? I meant to mention Alejandro, because he was just an amazing human being. And he was a physicist originally before becoming a theologian. But he was, I mean, if you read his stuff and stories like that about his appreciation of beauty and nature and all that, and yet he had this steely commitment that was, I mean, he just lived the gospel. As a physicist, he was working at Boeing, and when he became aware that he was, unbeknownst to him, the work he was doing was contributing to the building of the cruise missiles, he quit his job, confronted his bosses, was persecuted himself personally, and his family was persecuted for years after that by the CIA and FBI over there. And it was as if, this is just what the gospel calls for. I mean, so to me, he was a real inspiration.
I just wanted to add also Orlando Espino.
Oh, yes.
You know, because Orlando
He's still around.
Espino was
Still around.
immensely,
Still around.
we affectionately called him Espinitos. That's a long story there. But Orlando really is a person of great energy, and we owe him a lot. His publications, and particularly his shepherding our journal. Our journal for a long time. He worked very, very hard at a journal at the beginning for several years. And so we shouldn't forget Orlando.
Yeah.
Amen.
I'm going to add a couple, we're not going to get them all, but maybe in the Q&A that's going to come in a moment, you can add others. We should remember Maria de la Cruz Ames, who wasn't really so involved in ACHTUS, but she was already a giant as ACHTUS was starting in the catechetical world. Our first really committed biblical scholar, Gil Romero, was wonderful, made wonderful contributions. And she's also still around, but I have to mention Yolanda Tarango. She's been a great contributor. And there's many others. Before we move on to the next question, several of you told little anecdotes. If you want to add an anecdote about one of our ancestors, favorite story, you can get it at Cheesemate now if you want to. People are itching for some Cheesemate too, so anything you got. If not, we'll move on to the next question. But if there's any,
We can do the cheese fest only if you turn off the TV.
well then let's move on. Let's transition a little bit to thinking, and we'll move to a Q&A in a little while. But we've talked a bit about the past, the founding, your own vocations. What about counsel that you might give the younger members here? So let's start with the students who are present. And it's very different being a student now than when we were students. We know that. We know that it's different for you. You have a much different set of pressures and so on. But maybe this question, what do you wish you knew then that you know now that you would share with younger students? And keep in mind, you know, they are living a different reality than we are, but some of the counsel may still be very, very valid. So what do you wish you knew now that back then when you were starting? What advice, encouragement would you give the younger people? You want to start again?
Yeah.
Gracias.
I mean, I don't have to start.
Go ahead.
Something I learned that probably I could share with now we can say with the younger folks. When we started, the word acompañamiento was very popular. It was a theology of accompaniment. And what I have learned from the poor, and I can tell you that, over the 20-some years that I've been working with migrants and refugees, communities, is to broaden that understanding, to deepen the understanding of what acompañamiento means with the poor. Because acompañamiento, a good word, could mean, for me in those days was, I'm with you, I stand with you, te acompaño, more like the privilege with the surviving. And what the poor have taught me that I can share back, that I wish I had known there to influence my theology that it does now, is that solidarity takes us to a deeper place that gets us out of our comfort zone, out of the way we're used to thinking about the poor, out of the way we're thinking about assumptions about poverty, and invites us to enter the lives of the suffering poor to their pains, their hopes, and to enter their struggles so that we make their pain, their struggles, their hope our own. And so that real solidarity for me is allow those struggles, their dreams, to become part of me, their plight, to let them penetrate my very soul so that I don't speak about them, but I am them, we become them. And for me, that's been transformative, theologically, spiritually, ministerially, it's very transformative. Because in this way, it's kind of like allowing the poor to become our teachers, the poor to guide us. And this encounter then, for me, becomes mutual, a mutual thing. Not only acompañamiento, but mutual. Because we become part of each other's lives, and in doing that, somehow I become better, we all become better human beings because of that. And so that for me has become very transformative spiritually as well, because it opens us to the divine among us and in each other. It is like saying, it's no longer I, but Christ who lives in me, in that solidarity. And so in this grace encounter with the struggling poor, it's when I have begun to ask the deeper questions about life and ministry, especially as a priest. Does my lifestyle have anything to do with your suffering? And in answering that come the challenges of a prophetic solidarity. That is a solidarity of resistance, of love, of justice, and human rights. I just want to quote Oscar Romero for that. When the church hears the cries of the oppressed, it cannot but denounce the social structures that give rise and perpetuate the misery from which the cries arise. So to be prophetic in this sense is to engage in the transformation of humanity, confronting all of these unjust structures that make people suffer. And for me, now I could say, looking back, this has got to continue being a point of departure for U.S. Hispanic theology.
Yeah, I wanted to say something that Arturo mentioned at the beginning, is that at the roots of ACHTUS were a group of priests, former priests, women religious, former women religious, pretty much, that's what the group was. There was Roberto, but even he was an aspiring Benedictine. Okay. Okay, so what's the significance of that? Well, it seems that in our origins, we were certainly people that had not only a theological focus, but certainly a clearly pastoral one of engaging the community in the life of the community, and particularly the poor and the marginal and the forgotten, okay? We were very much into that, that vision of things. And indeed, who were our great heroes? Well, I think really we would say that there were two great heroes, at least for me. Virgilio Elizondo and Justo Gonzalez. And so there always has been, and at the beginning, I think we should say this, a really strong ecumenical thrust in ACHTUS. Because we had joint meetings with La Comunidad, remember?
Yes, I do.
With La Comunidad, with a comparable association of Latino Protestants, and which later on became
La comunidad.
yeah, La Comunidad, but there's another.
Oh, there's
one.
another IF.
IF, became IF, okay. Anyway, I think we should keep that in mind. But in reflecting upon what I would say the rather explicit religious and spiritual undergirding of what we were about, in the intervening years, ACHTUS became more what I would call academic. In other words, the membership shifted to some extent, not so much priests and sisters, or people that were going to care, had that particular kind of vocations in the church that would bring them toward pastoral engagement. But it became people who were really going to devote their lives to academic work, to writing, to the intellectual aspect of it, which is all fine, which is all good. But the only thing that concern that I have always had is the difference that faith makes, and strong faith makes, and the way in which academia, if you immerse yourself too much in it, it can get kind of sidetracked, for various reasons, because there's a strong drive toward a certain secular way of thinking, obviously, in academia, even in Catholic institutions, with a few exceptions. That kind of thing, and it seems to me, if I'm hearing things correctly, that in a way we're coming a little bit full circle in the sense that we had Tere Maya Sotomayor yesterday in her homily remind us that the Holy Spirit comes from on high. In other words, that we're relating to a transcendent God, and that what we were about has underneath it not just, the intellectual rigor that we hope to have, but also the connection to the life of faith and the Holy Spirit in what we are about. And so I think it's very good because I think it's energizing, and I think it will give whatever it is that we're about much more energy and resilience. Like the people we are accompanying, who manifest to us, from whom I believe we receive reassurances of how God upholds the poor, and God is identified with the struggles of the forgotten. And I think that we shouldn't lose that. And besides, academia is going, in the whole world, but academia is going through a period of crisis. And I believe that we can bring an integration of faith and the intellectual life, grounded in the acompañamiento of our people, that others may be not able to. I believe that Black Americans, I believe African Americans are bringing it also in the way they're working. So we have something very special to offer, and it's wonderful to see us going through, I think, a kind of revival at this moment in view of the serious challenges that we face.
I think some of the things that would have been helpful to me, in hindsight, would have been a mentor, but there was nobody around to mentor me, in the sense that we were the first line of women to start thinking about doing theology, and it's not the kind of thing that we talked about at home at the table. and not the kind of thing I talked about at school, and even in my community. We had people very educated, but for education ministry, hospital ministry, medical ministry, but not, as I was trying to recall, I don't think at that point we had somebody in theology in the same way that we were looking at. So I think mentors are really important, and I sometimes think to myself that it doesn't only have to be one mentor. You can have one mentor that can help you through your program, but you can have other types of mentors, you know, las madrinas y los padrinos, that you can call up and talk to for 5 hours if you want, because all you need to do is talk to somebody that isn't involved in your program but can listen to you and give you feedback. I think that's really important. The other thing I would say is I didn't need it because I think I naturally did it just because of the force of my darling father, who is I'm not an extrovert, but he was a super extrovert. He was, but the networking, I did it naturally, and there were so many beautiful opportunities. You wanted to hang out with us hermanos, you know, and every time you did, you learned something, and you know, you were given an opportunity, or guess this is happening. But I would say networking is really important. And I will also say another thing. Always be kind and good and welcoming, because you never know. It's that one person that you meet over coffee one time, and that person can come back into your life, and you want to be sure that that person is liable to be a friend than not. And I'm not just saying it out of, you know, self whatever, but really, uno no sabe, you just don't know. And it would be helpful to you nurture those relationships among your Latino friends and Latina friends and colleagues. Nurture those relationships. It's part of the familia, it's part of what's going to help you through, not just your studies, it's, you know, for the next 30, 40, whatever years ahead of you. And then the last thing that I think is fundamental is keep connected to our community. Keep connected. And what Ellen was saying has been a concern for me over the years. And sometimes I say to myself, it's like we have to learn a whole language. So some of us are bilingual. I speak English, I speak Spanish or Spanglish or whatever in between. And then I have to go out and learn a whole theological language, which is so foreign to me. I don't know why they just don't say the Holy Spirit. I just don't know why they just don't say salvation. I mean, I don't, you know, like, and so you find yourself almost having to learn this other language, and then you have to write in that language, and you have to defend in that language, and you do everything else in that language. And then you go home and you're sitting at the table like Darren was saying, and Abuelita's there, or whoever's there. And I mean, how does it translate? So maybe you have to learn another bilingual language. But whatever we do, it has to come from our communities, for the sake of our community, and so the community can benefit. Otherwise, they don't know what we're saying. I don't even know what I'm saying sometimes. So, I mean, that would be my advice to you. And I really feel for the challenges that those who are just beginning theology, or you're young in this development, because the challenges have just grown. And how many demands can you possibly have? You have to be able to do what the academy is requiring of you. You have to be there for your community. No sé, but
I have a chisme story about that.
oh, good.
A chisme story to follow up on the importance of what you said in relationships. In one of our sessions about popular religion, Orlando Spee, a Cuban, hablando con un mexicano, made a comment in one of his presentations about Our Lady of Guadalupe, that maybe, maybe Guadalupe, and pues se me subió. Se me subió, and boom. And so I got up and, al estilo mexicano cubano, and then it continued for 2 days. To this day, we're very close friends. 40 years, been good friends. We talked the other day. What you're saying is very important. We can disagree, and I think now he knows that que la Virgen es auténtico. And no hay ninguna duda, and so forth. But what you're saying is important. We disagreed, and we passionately talked about it, and we got to a new point, but we're being good friends because of that ever since. What you're saying is true. Un chismito nomás.
I just wanted to remind us. Many years ago, in one of the earlier articles by Roberto Goizueta, he reminded us that Leonardo Boff said that because we're identified with the people on the margins and with the poor, and we have a critical sense of our history, that we really should not take that as something that we hold against the church as an institution. In other words, that we need to continue to figure out how to continue to relate to the church as an institution. And the reason that Bob said that, and I think Roberto was repeating it, was that we have sometimes, particularly not in the Latino necessarily, but in the U.S. Catholic environment, especially a liberal and progressive environment, to take a more hostile attitude, a more critical attitude toward the church's institution. But we were warned that the people that we claim we're in dialogue with don't react necessarily that way. They know that the church has many arrugas and many imperfections and whatever, but not for that reason do they cease, in a way, to love the church even as an institution and to respect it even as an institution. And I think that's a very important point, because the Academy frequently has not gone that way. And it was Tere Maya. Is she still here? Is Tere Maya? I tell you, it was many, many years ago, Tere, that you reminded me, because she's a church historian of Mexico. She reminded me that the people who've written the history of Latin America have tended to be, or to influence it a great deal, have been the 19th century liberals, okay? And God bless the 19th century liberals, but they were very anti-clerical and so forth. Now, in the age of Pope Francis, we can be anti-clerical in a very positive, constructive, and synodal way, I believe. Okay, but not the 19th century approach to anti-clericalism, that discounts the structures that the church operates with, that frequently are rather sclerotic, but they have their hope, don't we? And I want to, before I forget, I don't know if we've thought about what's been happening lately. We had a pope totally formed on the spirit of Medellin and Puebla and Aparecida, who named the head of the dicastery for doctrine, who was one of the main writers of the document of Aparecida, Cardinal Fernandez. Okay? And now we have a pope who was very much favored by Pope Francis, Leo. Cardinal Prevost was, in 2 years, was identified and brought into the Vatican hierarchy and put in a position where he had made a cardinal, in a position that would allow him to become pope, okay? So what does it mean? It means that the very spirit that nurtured ACHTUS and the encuentro processes that we had in this country going back 50, 60 years is the one that is now leading the global reform of the church Francis started it. It looks like Leo is moving along more, perhaps a little bit more calmly, quietly, but he's moving in that direction. And we have been part of this for 50 years now. And so now, in a certain sense, we should really come forward even more so, because I think we have something to do with where the church is and where it must go.
Did you want to say it? I'll just open it up. Okay. Well, thank you for all this wonderful comments. We had another question on integrating, working with the community and the academic life, but actually there's been beautiful comments on that already. So let's take this moment to open to the group. Our time is running very short, so if you have a question or a comment, please make it brief. Maybe we'll get several people a chance to offer it. This conversation obviously is going to be ongoing. I think this is put at the beginning, not just because it's historical, but because now you can sit at meals with our four rememberers here, our four memory folks throughout the next few days. But we do have a few moments. So, you know what Thomas Aquinas said about preaching? Veritas, claritas, brevitas. So go for the brevitas. If you got a question, make it brief and we'll get a chance. Maybe for one or two each, we'll get a few voices.